All right, let's get started. Very exciting to have our closing plenary panel on policy, passive house, and a resilient New York future. After a day of, I think, really exciting, informative sessions, inspiring as well as cautionary about the difficulties and the possibilities of what we can do with passive house. And I think, right now there's a certain energy in New York and everybody's kind of wondering what's next, what's possible. And with the panel here today, a very distinguished panel that I'm thrilled to be able to put together, we hope to discuss some of that and maybe not come up with hard answers, but see what the possibilities might be and new ideas. So we have moderator. I'll just run through the names very briefly. The bios are all in the program. So our moderator, Al Appleton from Cooper Union, with John Lee from the Mayor's Office of Sustainability. We have Council Member Constantinides from Queens. We have Alex Wilson from the Resilient Design Institute, Lori Kerr from the Urban Green Council, Jessica Grove-Smith from the Passive House Institute, and Sebastian Moreno-Vaca from A2M in Brussels. So I want to just kick off the panel. Each panelist is going to do basically a 5-minute take from their perspective on the issues of the day and what we think is possible. And Al will then moderate a discussion, questions back and forth, and hopefully from the audience as well, I think, as well as from Al. So I thought we might just throw out some of the topics that sort of bullet points, if you will. The idea that we need to mitigate climate change, first and foremost. And we're getting serious about that we need to deal with adaptation and resilience, and particularly after the blackout and Superstorm Sandy. That the city and the state, for that matter, is getting very serious about this and addressing it with things like the 80 by 50 plan, One City Built to Last, identifying the issues and identifying buildings as a major source in the answer, a major part of the answer of climate mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. And identifying really sort of, carbon zero, net zero as the building goal, and seeing passive house, as I think Tim McDonald put in the last panel, as a really useful tool to get to that zero carbon goal. That retrofits are just an enormous issue, and everyone we talk about at all different levels in New York City, in particular, but everywhere, that retrofits, if we don't solve the retrofit problem, we're not going to solve the problem. And we need to figure out how to do retrofits really well, really deep, really fast. And housing, we have a goal of over 200,000 affordable housing units to be built in New York City, along with lots of luxury housing that's going up. How are we accommodating all of this? That we're going to be addressing big and complex buildings. Really exciting to see what should be the world's tallest passive house rolled out today at the conference. If the New York Times doesn't let us down for a third time, there will be an article on the front of the real estate section this weekend. It's been 3 weeks coming. And complex buildings. We need to deal with all of these issues. The idea of a renewable future that's essentially electric and fossil fuel free, and how is that going to be combined with the buildings that we need to build and optimize today for a future 30 years from now, and how are we integrating renewables into our buildings? And we have inspirational examples like Brussels, where they are going in whole hog, as one might say. And so it just really brings up some basic questions and thoughts about it. This is not necessarily questions that the panelists have to answer directly in any way, but just some thoughts that occurred. What are the drivers towards making passive house normal and driving the market? What are the impediments? What government actions are possible? and versus individual actions, or not versus, but in combination with. A big question, how do we lower the barriers in code in the market to passive house? How do we incentivize passive house? Is that possible? Are there dollars? Where would those dollars come from? Or are there other types of incentives rather than straight money? What do we see happening in other cities? Brussels comes to mind. And what can we make happen here in New York? What can we realistically talk about and not just be shooting the moon? So with that, I hand it over to Al and the panelists, and thank you.
Thank you, Ken. This is obviously a gathering of a great deal of energy and a great deal of promise. However, before I turn this over to the panelists, I've equipped myself with the keep your 5 minutes on time, please, or else. I want to make a couple of observations about the problem of mainlining this stuff. The city has only done one thing like this in the past. That's been its water conservation program of the 1990s. In that program, a combination of government subsidies, economic incentives, collaboration with both the industry and the real estate industry and the trades industry, particularly the Plumbing Foundation, reduced the city's water use by 35% in a period of about 4 years, saving the city essentially $5 billion for a cost of $550 million. Now, if one looks at the problem of making 80-50, and I'll have something to say about that as a goal later, the truth of the matter is it's all buildings. 75 to 80% of the energy use in New York City is building related. We don't do buildings, we don't do 80-50. If we were to do all of 80-50 by buildings, we would have to have carbon-free buildings. There are 807,000 buildings in the city of New York. So when we talk about policy, mainstreaming, retrofitting, we are talking about a huge endeavor. Hopefully our other panelists are going to give us a little bit of the puzzle. I would just like to make one suggestion. If I kind of look over the housing energy nexus industry, the thing that really strikes me is there's no central driver at the moment. That is, one of the things that made the water conservation program in the city work is DEP was the central driver of that program. It had the money, it had the institutional interest, it had the access to power to make a water conservation program work. We do not have that institution yet in the energy, housing, utility environment of the city of New York. And we need to think about that, and we particularly need to think about that in terms of where we are going with global warming. I want to talk about that a little more later too, but now I want to get to our panelists. We're just going to go right down the aisle from left to right. We're going to start with John Lee from the mayor's office.
Thank you. Also, I want to reiterate thanks to Ken and New York Passive House for honoring our mayor this morning with a Hero Award for his work in One City Built to Last. Also pleased to see that we've successfully co-opted the phrase built to last, which was once used to market heavy trucks, and now we're talking about energy conservation in buildings. With One City Built to Last, Mayor committed New York City to the 80 by 50 goal, establishing New York City as the world's largest city to make that commitment. What this really means in terms of buildings, and we're talking essentially about a retrofitting buildings scenario as has been articulated throughout the day today, it's essentially on average about 63% greenhouse gas reduction from buildings across the board. This is nearly 1 million buildings. We are at a current churn of where we expect maybe 100,000 plus minus buildings over the next 35 years will be new, and we could theoretically require all of them to be built to passive house, but that doesn't get at the majority of the problem, which is what do we do with our existing buildings. So One City Built to Last is, in fact, a 10-year plan to put us on the trajectory towards the 80 by 50 goal. It takes two parts. One is what we do with the buildings that are owned by the city, where the city can set example, and what we do with the private sector to enable energy efficiency improvements to buildings. The goals that we set for ourselves over the course of the next 10 years is a 35% reduction from city-owned buildings of greenhouse gas emissions and from private sector buildings, average of 30% greenhouse gas reduction. What we do with the city-owned buildings is a bit more direct. We have control over it. We can invest massive amounts of money in capital improvements. We train the staff that run these buildings. And we also offer up the city-owned buildings as a test bed for new technologies. For the private sector, we have less control here. And what our program here is attempting to do is to enable a marketplace for energy efficiency. And this begins with access to data. We've pioneered the largest benchmarking ordinance in the country, affecting 15,000 properties, approximately 26,000 buildings, and billions of square feet of real estate. This has enabled us to have the most comprehensive understanding of buildings that we've ever had, but it's only the beginning, and we must expand this knowledge base in order to understand what it is that we can do and must do in order to improve our buildings. Also, put resources into training of all participants in the buildings picture, purely vertical training, getting from the owners, developers, the occupants of the buildings, the trades that build them, and the operators and supers that run these buildings. We'll also expand the carbon challenge, which looks to our business leaders in the city to set the example to prove that these things are possible and that they make business sense. And we're about to launch the flagship program, which is coined the Retrofit Accelerator, where we found that most building owners do not have the resources to actually think about this. We've been spending decades trying to make the business case for us with limited success. The reality is, as was expressed in the prior panel, is that in the marketplace, few people care. Energy is very cheap, and we want to keep it cheap. That's part of what makes this country awesome and gives us the economic prowess that we have today. But we also all acknowledge that there is a cost of carbon that we are not accounting for. Even if we doubled the cost of energy, I'm not sure that people would still care. I spend more money on a monthly basis for my cell phone subscription than I do for my electricity. And even both of those combined pale in comparison to the cost I put into housing. With the Retrofit Accelerator, using the data that we understand about buildings, we can essentially handhold building owners and property managers through the processes to enable energy retrofits that will get us on the path to 80 by 50. Again, though, this is only looking at the 30% goal over the next 10 years that will put us on the path, but the 2050 solution is much harder. And given what we understand about the greenhouse gas emissions and the necessary kind of building that we need to have in 2050, they need to look almost like a passive house building. This will be about 1 million buildings. And the big question here is, how do we get to all of them? We stated that we will be looking to standards like passive house, net zero energy, to be the next generation of codes. And the promise of passive house is it doesn't require new technology. This is changing the way that we build and completely changing the mindset, again, across the entire vertical of everyone involved in buildings. I'm not worried about the participants in this conference in this room here. What I am worried about is getting to inside the heads of everyone that does buildings across all 5 boroughs, whether it's a walk-up, a single-family home, or a 50-story high-rise. The goal is to transform the way we build and retrofit, but then also to make retrofits necessary even when people don't want to. We see buildings all across the city that will go for 30, 40 years without ever doing anything with their building. Also, energy efficiency is invisible. We see many beautiful buildings today that look like buildings, and no one understands that this is passive house or necessarily cares. So we start with the codes. These are the minimum standards, but we need a paradigm shift in the way that we approach codes. Again, we'll look to passive house as the marker on the road. The next generation of codes, remember that passive house is just one tool here to solve an enormous problem, and this is the challenge that our mayor has put us to. With your help, get there. Let's get to work now.
Thank you, John. Councilman Constantinides, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Costa Constantinides. I represent the 22nd District that includes Astoria, Woodside, Long Island City, East Elmhurst, Jackson Heights. And I had the privilege of working for Councilmember James Gennaro in my previous life as his legislative director. And we were able to, the council has a long history of working on climate change issues. And, Councilmember de Blasio, then Public Advocate de Blasio, and now Mayor de Blasio has always had a keen commitment to the environment. So I want to make sure I recognize his great work and great partnership and thank him for his leadership. And Ken couldn't have picked a better hero for this organization. This is, in city government, we take it very seriously. We recognize after Hurricane Sandy that we don't have time to wait, and we have to take bold action. In 2012, we sort of made sure we coded that. Back in 2007, we set the reduction by 30% by 2030. And then this year, in 2014, as the People's Climate March Alliance, we realized that we had to take a bolder step. And I was proud to be the lead sponsor on the city's bill to reduce the emissions by 80% by 2050. The mayor has turned into Build to Last, which is a comprehensive program that's going to make our city greener and sustainable. But Passive House is part of that equation. And we have a great speaker, Melissa Mark Viverito, who is the lead sponsor, and I'm co-sponsoring with her Intro 701. To start, as John talked about earlier, we have the most control over city-owned buildings. City-owned buildings are the place where we can start. We don't need to get permission. We can start really drilling down immediately. And Intro 701 has a few different components. One, any capital project that is new, any addition or any subtraction that's more than $2 million would have to be built Passive House. Second, of those projects, 20% would have to have 10% on-site energy generation. So we'd be moving towards having energy generation on-site. Lastly, anything 3 stories or below would have to be a net zero. And I know we've heard from a few of you about standards and how the standards should actually work. And we definitely hear those concerns. And the speaker, I'm going to be working very closely with her. She has a strong commitment to get this done, has a strong commitment to the environment. So we are going to hear everyone's concerns and ensure in the future that all of that is taken into account. So I wanted to make sure I referenced that today. But speaking to Passive House, if you read the New York Times, they say there are 28 buildings in New York City at the moment. There needs to be a revolution. There needs to be an understanding of what Passive House is and what it can bring to the table in the private sector for us to move forward. We have a development out not in my district, but an organization that I work very closely with called HANIC, that they're opening a senior residence by 2017 that is going to be Passive House. And that's a great step forward. But we need to hear a lot more stories like that, much more in the tens and hundreds than just being up here to be able to report that we've been able to see that one organization take that step. We have to do better. And I think that in city government, not only 701, but for everything we do, in looking at how we get to 80 by 50, we have to take everything into account and be able to really start moving the needle. It's a big goal. As John talked about, it's the largest city in the world that's taken this step, but now we actually have to step. We have to start moving forward and start implementing, and the mayor set forth a good plan. The council is looking at many different priorities when it comes to geo and bio and a lot of solar, wind. We're looking at many different priorities to move the needle, including Passive House. So I'm looking forward to hearing that bill and working with our speaker very closely as she is the lead sponsor, as I said, and hearing more from you today than me speaking, because I think that working in government for 9 years, I've learned that I don't know everything, and I want to make sure that I hear from those in the community that are actually doing this and how we can better do what we do in city government. So thank you. I think I actually did under 5 minutes.
Yeah. I think If you're a congressman, you would have reserved your time. Alex Wilson, please.
Thanks. Those who have known me for a while know that for the last 10 years or so, I've been kind of like a broken record, saying that we need to be creating buildings that will maintain livable conditions in the event of lost power. It's something that we termed passive survivability back in 2005 in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in the Gulf Coast, when I was involved in an effort that resulted in developing the New Orleans principles. And after Katrina, I spent about 5 years advancing this concept of passive survivability in articles and speaking. And I gradually realized that the terminology was a little off-putting. I would mention the term, and I think people would conjure survivalism bunkers in Idaho and the survivalist movement in places like Alabama. But I saw it as a motivation to create better, more energy-efficient buildings that would, the same ideas we've been promoting in the green building world and the sustainability world, but a motivation of life safety, to keep people safe. So 5 or 6 years ago, I kind of shifted the terminology, talking about resilience instead of passive survivability, a little more palatable. And then in 2012, I launched the Resilient Design Institute to advance these ideas just a few months before Sandy hit. And at that point, all of a sudden, everyone was talking about resilience. But anyway, back in relative to New York City, back in 2008, I was invited to participate in a task force looking at greening the building codes. It was organized by Laurie Kerr, my fellow panelist here, and the Urban Green Council. And I brought to the table this idea that we should be our building codes should mandate buildings, new buildings at least, that maintain livable conditions if they lose power. It was a pretty radical idea and didn't get terribly far at that point. I think it got relegated to a footnote somewhere that it's something that we should research. But fast forward to 2012, following Hurricane Sandy, again, Mayor Bloomberg requested a task force be put together. The Urban Green Council took the lead with that. And again, I was invited to participate in that. And again, I was going to be promoting this idea of passive survivability. And lo and behold, that was front and center in the conversation. The city had seen buildings that lost power and people that were without power, and realized that had that outage happened in July when it was 90 degrees out, there would have been very serious health consequences. Anyway, so it became one of the 33 recommendations that came out of the Building Resiliency Task Force. I was thrilled to see that the recommendation hasn't been implemented yet, but at least it's on the table and being actively talked about. The other change that's happened since 2008 is the passive house movement. It was around in 2008 in Europe, but hadn't really made landfall in the US. But now we have a system for very easily specifying buildings that will maintain this level of passive survivability or resilience, maintaining livable conditions if they lose power. So, with Passive House, with efforts like we just heard about to, really mandate these kinds of changes, I'm really optimistic that New York City is going to take the lead in, showing how we can keep buildings safer and benefit the environment at the same time. So thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Laurie Kerr, please.
I want to talk a little bit about the promise and some of the challenges. So as we all are hearing repeatedly, the problem is 80 by 50. Buildings are going to be a huge piece of achieving that. We think that new buildings probably need to reduce their consumption from the average building right now by about 2/3. and existing buildings by about 45% in order to achieve that. Tall order. Enter passive house. I think in light of those very steep requirements, it has three real strengths. First is mathematically and on paper, it's a great fit. It gets us there, it gets us a little further than those numbers. So there's a little bit of flexibility to accommodate a number of issues. I think the second great advantage of passive house is not only does it get us there, it's probably the only replicable system that does that. So, and I think the third thing is that it's conceptually pretty simple to understand. So right now we have a 100-page building code with very technical requirements and lots of numbers, and it's hard for anybody to really wrap their mind around it. And then more to the point, it's hard to convey what that means across an industry and to the public. Passive house has a few simple concepts, a few numbers, that's it. So, and I think conceptual clarity really makes a difference when you're trying to go to scale. So, but I see a few really important hurdles that we would have to solve to really take passive house to scale in New York City. So there are 4 of these. I think first of all, and it's been mentioned before, 28 buildings does not a revolution make. We need a whole lot more, 10, 20 times more, and we need that to happen quickly. I think, and those need to be more varied. Most of the projects we've seen so far are residential and small at that. So we need hospitals, schools, office buildings, department stores, all these things. We need to start to see, you know, what the issues are in those other building types, start to gain experience solving them, and so on. So that's a local issue. That's an issue that we could solve through a program like they did in Brussels to really rapidly build up the local examples. A second challenge, I would say, is kind of a global challenge for passive house, and that's that the range of building types that it addresses well is not complete. So it's really, really great for the low energy buildings like residential, like educational, but it's not where heating is the dominant problem. It's not so great for buildings like office buildings or laboratories where, you know, some of the other, they're dominated by other issues like plug load, tenant consumption, operations. So now, right now, I think passive house is handling that on a case-by-case basis. You'll probably say it's more systematic, but it certainly isn't codified, and it's not something you could roll out. So passive house, I'm throwing it out, I think needs to tackle that, start to codify that, and make it something that can be rolled out at the large scale. I think a third issue is local and cultural, and that's the issue of windows. And in the typical passive house has a very small window-to-wall ratio, maybe 25%. And the real estate community in New York City will not accept that. The people that they're selling to want windows, they're more windows, they're paying a fortune to live in New York, they want a view. Again, I think this is solvable, and I think this one is probably going to be nuanced and have several pieces. Hopefully new technology can be a part of it, better walls, better windows, maybe some relaxation of the requirements of passive house can give more latitude, and maybe some relaxation of the expectation for windows in New York. So maybe moving a little bit in all areas. And then I think the final big hurdle will be our design and construction practices in New York, which are not to German standards by any means. So, how will we solve that? And I think we're going to have to be realistic about what the New York construction industry can do at the large scale. And then we're going to have to put massive energy into training. So I think, I put it out there. I think there's a lot to solve, but I think it's really thrilling that we are starting to have this conversation.
Good, thank you. Jessica Grove-Smith.
Okay, thank you. It's been a great day, first of all. Thank you for inviting me, for being here from the Passive House Institute. It's been great in a sense of I've heard a lot, okay, there's a lot happening in New York. It's a great time to come. It's a great time to feel what's going on. And I really have felt that something is happening. Speaking to all the people around, listening to the presentations has really confirmed people are committing to change. People really want something to happen. So it's kind of at the stage where there's a recognition Passive House is a solution, is a really important solution. In terms of environmental aspects, reducing emissions, it's an important part of reaching the targets. And also, as part of safety, resilience seems to be an important topic. Passive House also offers a solution in that aspect. So the question now is, what's next? Can pose the question to all of us as the panel. What's next? What do we do? We all want Passive House, but how do we go about it? How do we implement it? There are hurdles, yes, I agree. It's not a straightforward, we're just going to do it. But still the answer is just do it. We have to set strong targets. We know Passive House is the target we want to go to. And I think the important aspect is that everybody here in this room contributes with what they can do. So architects continue building their projects. Those involved in policy continue improving the policies, setting the stage, and motivating manufacturers, prepare, improve their components to make them available to the Passive House standard. It's everybody working together, keeping a positive outlook, and aiming towards the target. So I think there's different routes that we have to take. Policy is a really important aspect, and I think that's one of the topics of this panel, of us sitting here together. So I want to go a little bit more onto the topic of policy and regulation. The importance of policy, or the importance of, in parallel actually, individual projects, the importance of having policy is that it's setting examples, and it's motivating, and it's encouraging, it's setting incentives. It's important, I think, that policy has strong targets, has clear targets, has clear definitions like passive houses, even if there are hurdles and we want to move quickly and it'll be difficult to move quickly. It's important to have strong targets and say, okay, maybe we'll just do 5% by next year, and then we'll do a little bit more the year after that, a little bit more the year after that. But having targets that are kind of in between and nobody quite knows what they're doing is going to be confusing. So I think it's really important to say we're going to set a target. Passive House is what we want. That's the solution. We'll go there step by step, in a sense, not having something in between, but having first a few projects, then the next project, then the next project. So being very clear about the targets and about the standards that you're facing. It's a motivator. It's a driver. It's a driver for more projects being built. It's also a driver, I think, for the industry, for the manufacturers. Incentives are very important. Incentives in terms of quality assurance, quality on design. You want to reach everyone. As John was saying, he's not worried about people in this room. He's more worried about getting it out to everybody, having passive houses or having it in the wider community, those who haven't been involved in passive house so much yet. So that's one really, really important part of it is capacity building, teaching. So share the knowledge that you have, share your experiences, build more projects, and show that it can be done. And I think then we can be quite confident that people will follow suit. And Brussels has set a great example. So with these words, I'd like to pass it on to Sebastian. Thanks.
Our final panelist is Sebastian Moreno-Vaca.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to be brief because I talk enough and a lot this morning. What I can see from the outside is when I look at here now, you really, for us, achieve some, I think, minimum condition where you arrive at a key moment. Because most of the people here are, it's the proof that you fulfill the complete chain of a project process, from the beginning, developer, up to the users, through architects, contractors, etc. So we have seen this morning that under certain circumstances that you have here, this strong framework, it is possible to achieve a CO2 reduction of 20% in only 4 or 5 years. So the capacity is here. So I think that it's enough now that it's time for the municipality, that's what they're doing now, that they take their responsibility with a policy that is based not for only examples, but on local stock. I understood there is not so many buildings, but there are already significant buildings. So it's really by increasing the local stock that is going to make a change. So it's either by supporting incentive, whatever, but it's also by supporting people. And also I think when the city is showing also the way by doing passive house for their own needs, it's also a way to show to show the path. So at the end, there's many ways to reach the top of the mountain. Can be very technical way, etc. But what I believe, well, I'm not alone, is that passive house is not exactly an option. It's just an obvious necessity. Thank you.
All right, I'd like to ask to start the Q&A and the open discussion, I'd like to ask each panelist to comment on what they think is the most important thing they've heard here today. Sebastian, could you lead us off?
Well, there are so many. I would like to come back of the very beginning of this morning with local heroes. I would not only call just the city of New York heroes, but also people like Chris Benedict and so on. So it starts really with heroes, and well, as David Bowie say, we all can be heroes. So I think this is really the starting point. So these heroes.
Jessica?
This is really tough. Lots of good things I've heard, great. I'm gonna pick out Chris Corson. I'm gonna pick out the certification, manufacturer certification, because I think that's a really, really important part of bringing Passive House forward.
I would say that it's the, for me, it was learning about the new Passive House high-rise that Related is going to be building on Roosevelt Island. I think that for a city of high-rises, that's a real important breakthrough.
For me, I think it was hearing some of the examples of where it's being done. I mean, the fact that Chris Corson, for example, has been doing nothing but Passive House for 5 years and has factory components, factory panelized systems that are succeeding with that, I found very inspiring.
You know, I think sort of piggybacking on your point on high-rises, as we're seeing large amount of building happening in every borough of the city of New York. I can speak to my district where we're seeing a boon. Astoria is a place that is just literally exploding, and that desire for that waterfront view, but coupling that with Passive House and how do we sort of get over that obstacle is something to me that resonated right off the bat. We're going to see density as we talk about affordable housing and as we build out our city to meet the needs of those that live here, but how do we also institute Passive House into that sort of code? So that resonated as soon as you said it, so it's something I pulled from right away.
The tough question. There's a lot of great programming. I also want to applaud New York Passive House for putting a wonderful program throughout the whole day. I'm going to pick up on 2 things that came out of one panel. Am I allowed to do that? So it was the panel that preceded this one where we heard from the developers. First point was on that how, despite the promise that the marketing capability of Passive House did not pan out. And that reinforced the idea that what we do is invisible, and the kind of revolution that we have to make happen will not be seen. It happens inside our trades and professions, and no one else may ever know. The second point that what struck me also was, again, from the prior panel about the affordable housing angle on this. And what strikes me as quite remarkable, particularly in the United States, is that the biggest advances in building technology today are happening first with affordable housing. These are places where the government can set the most strict boundaries around what kind of development happens. And this is where it's proven in the marketplace that it can happen at reasonable costs with reasonable turnarounds. So that gives me much more strength and courage to think that we have to be more aggressive in what we do with our affordable housing in order to prove that this can happen.
All right. Now, what I was cynically grappling for was to try and come up with some balance point between the following two perceptions that I have. The first perception is this is an incredibly interesting, technologically vibrant, creative set of people, all of which bodes well for the future. The second is that there doesn't really seem to be any real insight into what do we do about this institutionally. I'm not sure I believe the 28 number is the only amount of passive housing. I've seen it figured to the extent that maybe 1% of the buildings in the city have had some kind of environmental treatment. Nevertheless, 1% of the buildings in the city is 1% of the buildings in the city. If we were to do 10 buildings a day in the city, which is clearly much more than we're doing now, that would take us 220 years to address all the buildings in the city. If we were to do 100 buildings a day, that would take us 20 years, and then we would begin to get into some scope. So the question I throw out to you and to the panel is, how do we get to a world in which we're doing 100 buildings a day? Anyone from the panel want to start with that? Then the audience. Lori?
Well, I think these things eventually have to find their way into the codes for new buildings and some sort of requirements on our existing building stock. But setting the groundwork for that sort of dramatic transformation doesn't happen overnight. So you have to create the models, bring the industry along, but we don't have a ton of time to do that. So we have to do this massive proof of concept, of which Passive House will be a part. I mean, I'm not entirely sure that all buildings will be Passive House or that be even an amended Passive House type answer will be the entire answer, but it will probably be a piece of it. But anyway, this has to happen very quickly. We haven't ever done anything like this before at this scale. So it'll be a tall order, but I think the codes will be probably central.
All right, anyone else in the panel? Councilman?
I mean, I think this is sort of the evolution of what we saw with LEED, where I think it needs to be LEED on steroids. We need to make sure that we sort of accelerate the desire in the private sector to grab on to Passive House, that there is a real value there for the developer, there's real value there for the residents, that the residents understand what Passive House is and are demanding it. When the industry, when those that build to have something that is desired, and if there is a desire of New Yorkers to go beyond LEED and to sort of attack Passive House and want Passive House, there's going to be a larger desire from the industry as well. So it's almost like LEED on steroids. So I'll say we have to sort of accelerate it in that way.
Nice metaphor. Alex?
Yeah, my sense is that with new construction, it's fairly easy. We can simply mandate it in building codes. Not that that's easy to implement, but in principle, it's easy, as Lori suggested. The challenge is with existing buildings, and I think with existing buildings we need incentives, and it's going to take a lot of creativity to figure out what incentives will work to, encourage building owners to make those changes. And then I think we need funding. We need a loan program, perhaps something modeled after the PACE program, Property Assessed Clean Energy, but a way, an access to money to make these changes with a mechanism to pay that back over time, perhaps through property taxes.
Alex, question. Do you know if anyone has done an analysis of how much money you would be talking about?
It's a good question. I don't know. I once did some back-of-the-envelope calculations back when we were spending billions, maybe $1 trillion on the Iraq War, to put that into perspective on what it would take to retrofit every building in America to, close to passive house standards. And it's on that order of magnitude, meaning the money we threw away or maybe not spent wisely in Iraq, if we had been able to put that into our housing stock, it would have made extraordinary differences.
Okay. Any other comments?
Panel? On the money side, I would say that it's probably in the range of about $150 billion.
That's B.
In New York City, which sounds like a lot, but it's over 35 years. And it turns out to be about a 10% increase to construction activity in the city of New York. So it's big, but it's not like staggering. It's not doubling what we do. Now that includes infrastructure projects as well as construction projects, but in other words, you would increase the expenditure in New York City by about these are orders of magnitude, 10%.
All right, any comments on this from the floor? Well, obviously. The gentleman in front in the nice shirt.
To further this,
I
think that's enough for now.
Good.
I think that's enough for now.
Sir.
Might I suggest, as a concept, that we believe that it is in the public interest that a restaurant have a letter code in the window. And we have created a system by which the city issues a score for a restaurant. Now, it's not about the taste of the food might be to your liking or not, it's about the public health issue. This is, in effect, a public health issue.
True.
Perhaps the simple solution is we need to create a letter code that it gets assigned to every building and every property at every transaction, whether it be a rental or a sale or operation. And now when you walk down the street, oh, that's a C-grade building from an energy standpoint, as it is a C-grade restaurant from a health standpoint. And now the private sector will have a big incentive to dig into the pocket and do what's needed to be done. And that's something the city could do from its legislative position.
Interesting idea. The lady in the back. Interesting idea.
My question is directed to John Lee. Considering passive house as a new model in building, has New York City considered passive house tax credits or subsidies as incentives for owners and developers through a process that lists positive steps and actions taken by owners and developers towards the certification process.
Yes. How shall I answer? Yes, we are looking into this. I cannot say that we would, at this point, commit to something like that, but that is within the suite of options that we are considering in order to enable this kind of market.
I got the mic.
Oh, you got the mic? All right. It's called force majeure in law.
I think that what everybody's been saying has been absolutely great. And I mean, we do need the policies, we need the codes, we need the incentives, we need all that. But I think we need we need the rhetoric, we need the advertising, we need the vision, we need buy-in from the public. I think that one of the reasons that the water saved so much over such a short time, if people remember it, was that was advertised everywhere, and it brought buy-in from all of the stakeholders, and we need somebody to come forward with vision. And I think that the fact that nobody knows about it with the realtors like trying to advertise this is about the fact there is no vision for this being put forward by our politicians. So those with access, I would really encourage that.
That's remembering having run that program, that's exactly right. We did an awful lot of public education of all kinds, including some programs that were not dissimilar to the letter code that were proposed here, although we did them privately, not publicly. Next.
I'm from Philadelphia, and in Philadelphia we have an aging infrastructure with our gas. We have buildings that are blowing up and a many billion-dollar budget that's been talked about over the next 30 to 50 years to replace that infrastructure. I think that New York City has some similar problems. Is there a way to think synergistically across different sectors to say you could take certain neighborhoods, cocoon them to passive house standard, wean them off gas, take the money that would have been spent in that infrastructure, transfer it, and then also encourage the electrical energy suppliers, utilities, to fund this and promote the all-electric house. So by crossing these various sectors and by using funds from one to help fund the other, because after all, if we spend the next 30 to 50 years replacing our gas lines, by the time we're done, gas will no longer be around and we will have wasted that effort.
Any comments from the panel on this one? Councilman? You're my go-to guy today, Councilman.
Hey, sounds good, Al. Sounds good. We go back a long time from the hydrofracking. So, but no, I mean, it's definitely something I can't commit to today. I think that might be the catchphrase. But looking at every opportunity to implement and take action would never be a bad thing. So I'd be happy to speak with you offline to see how we could, model something.
I think one of the interesting things of that implication is we heard a discussion from Alec about the money spent on Iraq. The amount of money spent on gas fracking and the amount on gas infrastructure, particularly given the methane leakage problem. I was in Calgary once meeting with a bunch of natural gas executives, and the one point I actually made some dent in them is when I said we were spending about $500 billion a year to develop gas fracking as an industry. If you had $500 billion to spend on a new energy industry, is this what you would spend it on? And I think we want to ask similar questions about affordable housing and about our urban infrastructure. If we have all of this money, is this what we want to spend it on? Okay, next.
Hi, I have the mic now.
Okay.
Sorry, I was dying to ask this question to the councilman and to John Lee, Sustainability Department. So recently, I'm an architect, and I also did the first certified passive house in Brooklyn, retrofit. I was asked to be under an umbrella for New York City Build It Back, taking, I think it's city and federal funds to help people that were affected adversely from Hurricane Sandy, like in Far Rockaways. And my understanding of it is that it's hundreds of projects over the next couple years that are different typologies of homes that need to be fixed. And we're supposed to take on like 2, 3 at a time, and there's teams of people to do this. Can I challenge that we make them Passive House and FEMA proof at the same time, and that gets us many homes right away? So.
Sorry, we're just passing the mic around here. I am also an architect in Brooklyn who also did a certified passive house. And I think something that could really move the needle would be if we could tie this together with building department reform and maybe create a separate fast track process for certified passive house projects. So that's our idea.
Come on, John, you got to say something.
Sure.
That's the spirit. That's the spirit.
So I have to applaud the enthusiasm for the suggestions, and they make, as commentary, very pragmatic sense. And I've spent the better part of a decade in the throes of government and have been beating my head against the walls of bureaucracy to at least understand now that the thing which you're describing is an incredibly complex issue. Take, for example, the buildings department reform, that the sustainability angle is just a very small part of a much larger problem that spreads around accountability, integrity, safety, security, and our energy future. These are all challenges that have to be met at once, and we have certainly inserted ourselves into this combination of issues. We're trying to elevate sustainability and energy efficiency to the top. Our mayor, our hero, has certainly made this primary point of his agenda. We have a couple of years left. We'll make it happen.
I have one question.
I'm told by my master we have time for 2 more questions.
Okay. I have a question. Thank you all for being here. This has been wonderful. My question is, obviously we need to figure out how to pay for this if we're going to implement this. And everyone's talking about the price tag, but no one's really talking about what that is as far as an investment in the local community. One statistic I read just recently is that every $1 million invested in energy efficiency measures creates 57 job years. Has anybody, excuse me, taken that $150 billion number and figured out how many jobs that would create? So 57 job years, that would be 1 job for 57 people for a year, or 1 job for 1 person for 57 years.
Anyone on the panel know anything about this?
No, not to my knowledge.
Well, there are a fair number of studies of solar energy versus fossil fuel. They've been pretty promising. The other statistic, of course, is from the city's water conservation program. When we did the retrofits in partnership with the Plumbing Foundation, that was 1,200 man-years of work for 1,200 jobs for 18 months. So that's fairly significant investment in building efficiency and in employment. Last question. Who's got the mic?
I have it. My name is Dr. William Esposito, and I spent about 12 years up at Columbia University studying asthma, childhood asthma in the South Bronx and Harlem. Getting back to the passive house and what the gentleman was saying about the letter on the doors, this is a major public health issue. Asthma is directly related to dilapidated housing. And if you have a building that has an air barrier, That means the roaches, the mice, and all of the other insects will not be able to get into the apartments, and they can be controlled a lot better. So I think what we have to do, especially on the affordable housing side of things, in your Intro 701, maybe we should take the public health benefit of better health of our children. So that's just a comment. Look at the public health side.
If I may make a comment on that comment, I think that's the kind of insight we need to weave together in an overall program. Before I turn this back to Ken, I would like to make a couple of final observations, abusing or using, whatever you want to call it, my position as moderator. First of all, I think one of the interesting questions passive housing raises is, do we have to do everything as a full passive house? Or are there features of passive houses we want to cut out? And when we talk about code reform, it's very important to look at code reform can cover not only new buildings, but existing buildings and the replacements. One of the things that drove the interest in our toilet rebate program was we put into the building codes a requirement that any replaced toilet in the city, for any reason, broke, whatever, had to be a low-flow toilet. So the building owners came to the logical conclusion that it was better to take our rebate program and clean up this now rather than get stuck with paying it themselves later. So it is possible, I think, to design some of these incentives with respect to particular features. The second thing, of course, is that the Plumbing Foundation played a huge role. Now, I would hope that the passive house community, because there's not a passive house foundation here, will understand that it can play an enormous role in structuring these programs. Now, as I said at the beginning, I am very concerned of the fact that there is no central driver. Nobody to kind of say, the next step we got to deal is with A and B. We're all a bunch of essentially freelance green energy entrepreneurs at the moment, you know, moving across a complicated landscape that includes urban infrastructure, affordable housing, FEMA, resilience, a word that I'm afraid we're all going to be very tired of hearing in another couple of years, that has to weave all of these things together. At some point, we need to think about where we put this. Logically, are the utilities and the fossil fuel industry would conclude that they're beating a dead horse and that this is the horse they want to get onto and drive. Unfortunately, they're not doing that, so we're going to have to think about how to do that ourselves. I want to thank all of the panelists on behalf of the Passive House Foundation and Passive Program. I think it was the most enlightening presentation.
Thank you, Al, and thank you, panelists. It really was fantastic. Wow, a lot of interesting and provocative thoughts and things to consider going forward. I want to thank all the participants today, really all the speakers, wonderful presentations throughout the day on a wide range of topics tying into Passive House. I would like to thank our sponsors again and our award nominees from this morning as well. So thank you all for coming. Please get involved in New York Passive House, if you're from other areas, your local Passive House organizations. Please share your information. Don't keep secrets. One of the great strengths of the Passive House community has been the sharing of knowledge and building from each other. So we go forward and we look for greater success in the coming year. So thank you, everybody. Thank you. Thank you.